Angela, I'm just going to ask you a very basic question to start with. This is about Angela's book, Inferior, and how science essentially, for the longest time, considered women to be an inferior segment of our species. And I just wanted to ask you to start with what generated or what triggered the idea to even go into this topic and write this book.
So I wrote this book quite a long time ago. It's one of my earlier books. And what happened was I was just a journalist covering technical topics, engineering, and then I had my son. And after I went back to work, after I had my son, I had to take whatever work editors would give me. And an editor asked me if I wanted to write a story about the menopause, which I'd never thought about before, certainly not at that time in my life. And it just so happened that a paper had just been published in Canada by 3 male scientists arguing that the reason that women go through the menopause is because throughout evolutionary history, I have to be careful here that there might be children, but that women just weren't having any sex. That older women were just celibate, essentially. The older men were still having sex, but older women weren't. And it got a lot of abuse, this paper, because there just wasn't a good mechanism there.
What year was this?
This must have been 2014 or 2015, so quite recently, not a very long time ago. And that sent me down a rabbit hole, essentially, because what was fascinating to me was that these 3 male scientists were arguing this very tenuous case, but the biggest, most the leading hypothesis for the menopause, evolutionary reason, was that older women are so crucial to the survival of their children and grandchildren. And we can see that. You can see statistically, even today, the presence of a grandmother in a family raises the odds of survival and the lifespan of her children and grandchildren. So we have a very good evolutionary mechanism there, a biological reason for why this might be the case. But this grandmother hypothesis is mainly worked on by women. Now, if science were completely fair, if it doesn't matter what your background is or what your identity is, then why would you get this kind of gender difference in the kind of theories that people have? And that made me start thinking then, what other areas of science do these biases exist, this kind of prejudice? And as it turns out, the entire science of gender difference is deeply political and very fraught and just full of misconceptions about women.
Back when I was in college, I remember taking a course called Science and Society. And as I was reading the book, a lot of that kept coming back to me because the whole premise of that course was that science is not neutral. Science is affected by social attitudes, and therefore scientific research is often also inflected very much by what scientists think. And scientists are creatures of society. Let's go back to a little bit of history because your narrative is really interesting. It begins with somebody as iconic as Charles Darwin. And we discover that Darwin, so much for his theory of evolution, so much for what he achieved, was also a bit of a sexist. And not because he was perhaps actively sexist, but he was conditioned to think in a way where he said that women were biologically somehow inferior to men. And he sort of stuck to that argument.
Yeah, in some ways. So Darwin is an interesting figure because Charles Darwin was such a careful, thoughtful scientist who was so very cautious in every other part of his work. But then when it came to women, he wrote quite openly in his published work and in his personal private correspondence with other women that women are the inferiors of men in every way except morally. So morally we're superior, but in every other way we're inferior. And this was just really, as you say, it's just a product of him looking at Victorian British society and thinking, well, women aren't doing what men are doing, maybe this is natural. And of course, it wasn't natural. It was because women didn't have access to the same education as boys. They didn't have access to the professions. They couldn't go to university. So, how were they supposed to be doing what men were doing? It was quite lazy in that way of Darwin to make this assumption, but then everybody was making it. This was just how mainstream Western science looked at that time. But he was challenged. So there were women who wrote to him, who challenged him and said, please think again. Think more carefully about why society looks the way it does. But I find even now, there are scientists who are publishing things and sometimes contacting me with just bizarre ideas about women and saying women can't do engineering, women can't, telling me, I studied engineering at university, you can't do engineering, you can't do science, your brains are wired in a different way. And I think what it comes down to is that we find it hard to believe that society is something we have created. We tend to believe that it is nature that is driving everything, but also there are many people out there who are committed to leaving things the way they are, who don't want women to get ahead, and so they use these kind of biological arguments.
It's quite interesting you said that, there are these people who still think women can't do engineering, etc., because you also have a segment in your book where you talk about how scientists have this great appetite for constantly comparing the size of the male brain and the size of the female brain. And because women tend to have smaller brains slightly, they assume that that necessarily leads to a change in behavior. But you make this interesting argument that fundamentally it is the brain. There is no such thing necessarily as a male brain and a female brain, and it doesn't really add up. So we're already beginning with an assumption that there is a male brain and a female brain, whereas if you look at it objectively, it is just a brain.
Yeah, I mean, every single brain is different from the next brain, and what we think of as feminine characteristics or masculine characteristics actually exist throughout all individuals. So in every single one of your brains, you will have some female characteristics, some what so-called male characteristics. But really, these are just traits. These are just qualities that people have. What we think of as feminine or masculine is a cultural value. It's not really anything else. And this is why, if you look globally, the number of women researchers, the proportion of women researchers actually varies quite dramatically. So in the US and in Europe, the proportion is quite low. In the Middle East, in parts of Asia, but especially in South America, it's actually very high. So the majority of scientific researchers in Latin America are women.
You also said something about Saudi Arabia, I think, somewhere in the book where you said that they have a high proportion of women. Was it Iran? One of those?
Yeah, there are some Arab, Middle Eastern countries in which you do have a high proportion of women in medicine, in science and engineering. I mean, medicine in particular, globally, has become more of a female profession in that sense, demographically. But part of the reason for that is, again, cultural, because in countries where you have segregated universities and segregated facilities, then you find that, well, of course, you're going to have a higher representation of women because women aren't being held back that way.
I remember reading this very puzzling because apparently, India, where women don't necessarily have the best life possible, apparently India also has the highest number of female pilots. Yes. And people can't really square this because they don't understand it. And I'm curious, to what extent does class, for example, affect this? Do you think class somehow determines the level of potential that a woman is able to actually reach?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I'd recommend here a book that came out a couple of years ago. I wrote the foreword for it, Lab Hopping, which was written by two women science journalists, Indian science journalists, who traveled the country and interviewed women scientists, gender non-conforming scientists, to ask their opinions on what it was like, their life stories. And you often get, it's not just gender, obviously, that determines your outcome. It is things like class and caste. Caste in particular in India. I mean, I spent a little bit of time when I was researching my first book, Geek Nation, at IIT Delhi, which was at that time, this is about 15 years ago, a very male place. There were very few girls there. And they almost seem to prefer it that way. There's a culture that emerges that says that, oh no, girls are for something else, boys can do this. And I found it myself that even very average, academically average boys will think it's fine for me to become a scientist or engineer, whereas girls will often think I have to be brilliant to be a scientist or engineer. So what you often find is that at the very top universities globally, you get quite a good ratio of women to men in engineering and sciences now. But if you look at the middle tier ones, so where the more academically average ones, you actually get far more boys. And I think that's the gap that we have to leap, is to remind girls that you don't have to be academically brilliant to be a scientist or engineer. In fact, many male scientists and engineers are not academically brilliant. This is a career you can do anyway.
I want to go back to the whole conditioning bit because as you were speaking, I was also thinking about how growing up, maybe because I was a boy and we are conditioned differently, I always remember telling my parents, I want this or I want that. I'm 17, I want a mobile phone or I want a bike or whatever it was. And for some reason, to my sister, it never even crossed her mind that she could demand things. It was always after I got my way that she got her way, even though she's 4 years older, because she was conditioned to think that she couldn't necessarily ask, and not because my parents actively did anything. It was just, I think, the broader climate in which we all live.
Well, it really does depend on your family culture. I mean, I was very lucky. My parents emigrated from Punjab in the 1970s. They were part of that diaspora that moved overseas. My dad was an engineer, and we were three sisters. And my dad's philosophy was always that work is work. It doesn't matter if you do it at home or you do it outside the home, work is work. And him and my mother did everything. I mean, after they retired, because my mum is younger than my dad by quite a few years, she took up another career. And he does everything at home. And when we visit, he still does everything. And it's not remarkable to us because we grew up that way. It was a real shock to me to visit other people's homes and see the father sitting there reading the paper while the mum's in the kitchen. I just thought, this is bizarre. What, are we in the 1950s that people live like this? I just didn't believe that anyone lived like that anymore. And I think that's part of the reason that I went into engineering myself, and part of the reason that I've challenged through my work, but also in my personal life, in my own family. I've designed things, I've worked with my husband to design things in such a way that we split everything down the middle. There is nothing that he can do that I can't, and vice versa. And if anything, I do the DIY at home, obviously, because I have an engineering degree. That's not strange to us. And it's important because that's the message then our son will get, that there is no such thing as women's work or men's work.
While you were talking again, I was thinking of all these hyper masculine male podcasters on YouTube who are all about men becoming domesticated leaves them as lesser men. They're no longer men if they get domesticated by their wives, if they're sharing in the housework, if they're sharing in care work for children. Somehow it sort of takes away their masculinity. And your book has so many examples of scientists themselves having similar views. But it also makes you think, is it even possible for us to aspire as creatures of society and an imperfect society? Can we ever actually have objectivity? Or is everything fairly subjective at the end of the day, even in science?
I struggle with this because I do think that so much of the world as we see it is constructed. That's not to say that nature plays no part at all. It does. I think the argument within the science is always how much. How much is nature? How much is nurture? And it's almost an impossible question because we are such a social species. If there is one thing that sets us apart from other primates, it's that our brains are plastic. They change even into adulthood. We're capable of learning so many different things, which is why we have so many rich, beautiful languages and cultures all over the world. So for anyone to just sit back and say it's all biology, it just flies in the face of the evidence. And it does make me laugh when I hear, for example, Mark Zuckerberg was saying that Silicon Valley needs more masculinity. Mark Zuckerberg is one of the least masculine people I know. If anything, what
Maybe that's why he's saying it.
Who is he talking about? It's just very strange. Like I said, these traits that we think of as gendered exist in every single one of us, and we should embrace it. I mean, why narrow yourself, put yourself in one tiny little box and tell yourself that's the only way that you can be?
You have this line in the book where there are these two Victorian scientists who are arguing that the sperm in the male body is naturally active because that's how it functions, whereas the egg is naturally passive. So and fundamentally, therefore, men and women have active and passive roles in society. And there's a line where one person in defense of this says, what was decided among the prehistoric protozoa cannot be annulled by an act of parliament, which I thought was a hilarious line because he's again claiming that no matter how much I mean, in contemporary jargon, no matter how woke we get, no matter how much we as a society want to change, how we argue for it, some of these things ultimately boil down to biology. So the question then is, you alluded to it, that it's very difficult to draw the line as to how much is biology and how much is nurture. But you're certain there is a degree of biology that does separate the male from the female in the same species.
I mean, there are very basic things. For example, reproductive biology, of course, that's one thing. But then not all women can have children. Not all women want to have children. And then every other trait, I would say, sits on a spectrum. Some, we have some every individual will have a mix of different traits. So it's very difficult to say that all men are this way, all women are that way, because we only have to look among our own friends and family. We only have to look in this room to know that that's not true, And so that, even the traits that we think of as very rigidly masculine, there will be women who have some of those traits. So I think that is what bothers me the most, is that why do we have to resort to this binary every single time to understand everything, when we can see so clearly in ourselves and in each other that that binary isn't consistent? It clearly fails at some points. Can we think more expansively about that? And I think that's one of the beautiful things about non-Western scientific traditions, particularly in India, is that there is that more room for metaphysical expansion in the way that we imagine the world, that we tend not to think in very discrete, rigid ways, that there is room for thinking beyond that. And actually, science is moving in that direction. So there is more work being done trying to pick apart what we think of as biological difference, and it's actually more to do with human difference sitting on a spectrum.
Is it changing because there are more women in science now? Is that one of the reasons why?
It is part of the reason. So there is such a thing as the feminist science movement, which has tried very hard since the 1970s onwards to introduce new ideas into this, and has provided a corrective. Some of the research you were talking about, which was just so strange, trying to argue that women shouldn't get the vote because it would damage their reproductive capacities to have public lives and go to university. This is kind of strange things that people were arguing in the early 20th century. So we needed a corrective, and that is already happening. In fact, it's happened. Now we're starting to think, okay, now what next? How do we go beyond just thinking about biology as male and female and thinking what comes after that?
On your earlier point, I have one more question of a more contemporary nature where I'm going to seek your opinion, which is that these days in sport, we often come across these cases where these women are tested and then they're banned or they're sort of disqualified, saying that, oh, they're not sufficiently female, or they're more masculine, etc. How does one negotiate a complex situation like that?
It's very difficult. So the book I'm writing at the moment, which will be coming out next year, is looking at classification. Why is it and how is it that governments and institutions decide to classify people the way they do? Now, modern international athletics has two categories, male and female, and now there's a Paralympic category as well. But within male and female, the reason that we have those two categories is because the Olympics was originally just for men. There was no women's category at all. In fact, the founder of the modern day Olympics movement said women shouldn't be doing any Olympic Games. So when women were introduced, the idea was that they needed a separate category because they couldn't compete with men. As it transpires, of course, there are average physical differences which at that elite level of sport do play out. So even if the average man can be beaten by an elite female athlete every single time, an elite male athlete, it's a different question then. You're talking about a different kettle of fish. But there are certain sports in which men and women sometimes outperform men. Shooting is one of them, archery, long distance running. Women are beating male records in long distance running. And there are some arguments. I read a book recently that said that if you look at women's sporting records, they are matching men's sporting records consistently from 30 years ago. So there's a 30-year lag or a 20-year lag. And women haven't been playing competitive sport for that long. So if this book argues, and it's a controversial argument, I don't know if I agree with it, but this book is arguing if women had been playing competitive sport and if as much investment was made in women's sport for as long, then maybe that gap would be much smaller than it is right now. Now, I don't know if that's the case. This is where that biology question really hits the rubber and the road, but I think it's exciting to maybe consider, are there different ways of organizing sport? You know, same way that weightlifting is organized by class, weight class, we could possibly do that in other sporting arenas. Certainly long distance running, that could be made a gender neutral sport, I think.
Again, a connected social question, which is that now we're seeing more women in sports, we're seeing women beating men, as you were just saying. How much of this is linked to girls having better nutrition in today's world? Because you also make the point somewhere in the book that culturally, in many societies, the female child didn't necessarily get the same amount of nutrition as the male child, and that obviously would have some kind of physical consequence on the child.
I mean, it's interesting to see that we imagine the physical differences between men and women to be consistent. Actually, the sex difference in height between men and women, the average difference, is different depending on the society that you're in. So in some cultures it's smaller, in some cultures it's bigger. And what some anthropologists found was that in matrilineal societies, so of course in Kerala, there were the Nayars, who were a matrilineal society, which you've written about yourself. But there are other matrilineal societies around the world. And what they see is that the height difference among men and women in these matrilineal societies is smaller than in neighboring patrilineal societies. Now, why is that? It could have something to do with nutrition. It could be, you know, how people are raised. Certainly these cultural norms that tell us women eat after the men, even if that means they eat less, or this idea of deferring, you know, we give the men and the boys a bit more to eat than we give the women. It's deeply unfair. And also, you know, beauty standards that say that you need to stay slim if you're a woman, and if you're a man, you need to get big. Well, that obviously is going to have some impact on how people live into adulthood. So again, we need to be careful that what we imagine to be very big sex differences can sometimes be amplified by the way that we behave.
I was reminded of a story my mother told me. She used to run, and she, I think, made it to the district level, and she won medals and all of that. And then some cousin of hers who was in the army came and told my grandmother once, apparently, that, oh, you know, if you let your daughter run like this, she's going to turn masculine and nobody will marry her when she grows up, which I thought is reflective of some of these things that we're hearing about. But, you know, there's, coming back again to the science, there are all these experiments that scientists have conducted over a period of time. And you show that a lot of the experiments themselves are highly flawed. In many cases, it isn't a neutral experiment. In many cases, the scientists' conditioning is affecting even the way they choose their samples or even the way they arrange things and so on. For example, there's this bit about girls, whether they like dolls in pink or whether they're naturally programmed that way, or whether, you know, like boys, they would prefer mechanical objects. And it's interesting because that chapter does talk about some possibility that maybe male babies do prefer the mechanical as opposed to the females, but still it's very difficult to reach a conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to separate nature and nurture. So one approach that researchers have taken is that they look at very young children, because the assumption is that if you're a very young child, then you haven't been affected by culture as much as if you're studying
adults. So how
young? Babies. There's very few studies of this kind, because how do you study babies? It's very, very, very difficult. So anyway, there's this very famous paper in which they took newborn babies, so in the hospital, and they showed them a picture of a face and a picture of a mechanical object. I'm sorry if I have the details wrong, but this book was written a long time ago. And then they would look at, what does the baby look at? The face or this mechanical object? And they said in this paper that the male babies looked at the mechanical object more, and the female babies looked at the face more. So I went to it's a very small difference, but they said that they found it. Anyway, so I went to find the woman who carried out that piece of research. She was a PhD student, just young. She was doing it for her supervisor, who's an expert in this area. And it was his hypothesis that there is such a thing as a male brain and a female brain. And when I asked her about this, she said, you know, even I know that there was bias in this experiment, that I was leaning in and, you know, I may have influenced the outcome because a newborn baby can't see very well anyway. It's very difficult to know where it's looking. And so she very openly admitted to me, she doesn't work in science anymore, she does something else, that there was every likelihood of possibility of bias in this experiment. And that just goes to show that our desperation to see these kind of results sometimes outweighs the results themselves, that the results really aren't there. That's the only piece of research we have, and even that is clearly not very good. And that's the problem here. We can't separate these things, and I think the only real answer is just let girls do everything. Why would you stop them? Just let them do what they want to do. Let boys do what they want to do. It's the hardest thing as a parent, though, to just allow our children to be themselves.
You know, there's also this whole question where you do have this line where you say that aspects of gender identity are rooted in biology, aspects of it. And you have this interesting point about how sometimes political correctness or political and social trends can determine whether some subjects can be studied or not. For example, in the 60s, after the feminist movement, studying male-female differences became slightly unfashionable in science, and then it was revived in the 80s, of course. I believe in today's world also, where we have the idea of wokeness, etc., there would be topics that are sort of taboo because socially they're not acceptable. How far does that affect scientific research to sort of flip the whole social thing?
It does make a huge difference. So one of the reasons that there is so much more work being done, for example, to understand transgender, intersex biology is because of social awareness around these issues. But at the same time, what has really surprised me is that you would think that with woke culture, we would have less investigation of sex difference in biology. In fact, we have much more. And what I've seen among feminists is that there has been a return to a biological essentialism. This claim that, for instance, drugs tested on men don't work in women. That's not true at all. It's not true. We all take the same drugs. They have the same effect. But this myth has emerged over the last 30, 40 years that our biology is so different that these huge medical differences exist. So the book I'm writing at the moment, I interrogate that very question. And I think part of it is rooted in this idea that there is a disappointment and a resentment and an anger among many women that they feel, for example, misunderstood by their doctors, or that when they're in pain, they're not listened to in the same way, that we accept female pain in a way that we don't accept male pain. And those are very legitimate things. These are real problems that women patients face, but that doesn't mean necessarily that our bodies are different underneath, and that's why we're experiencing these things. Of course, that's not to say there aren't biological issues. Of course, there are. Menstruation, menopause, hormonal issues, autoimmune diseases. There are very many. But it's about keeping a balance, right? Of understanding where the differences are, but not assuming that everything is different.
I wonder if doctors, and I'm assuming many doctors are men, are sort of culturally sensitized to speak to their women patients a certain way. Because I remember we had a house help at one time and she had a urinary tract infection. And she refused to accept it because good women did not get such infections. It was considered socially unacceptable from where she came to talk about something to do with your genitals or the urinary tract or whatever. And it's not as if the doctors have a way of understanding where the woman's coming from, because she's not going to explain to him in so many words that this is what she's feeling. So it's again fascinating how much society ends up playing a role when it comes to all of these things.
Yeah, and in fact, everyone does it. So, for example, the most common heart attack symptoms are exactly the same in men and women. And women, at least in certain countries, are at a very high risk of heart attack. But heart attacks go underdiagnosed in women, partly because even women themselves having heart attacks don't believe they're having them because they think this is something that happens to men, it doesn't happen to women. So not only the doctors, not just the nurses, everyone around them and themselves believe that heart attacks are a male problem, not a female problem. So there are, these gender stereotypes, these gendered ideas we have work in very strange ways, and they affect every single one of us. It's not just the case that male doctors are unfair to women. Female doctors are also sometimes unfair to women because of these stereotypes.
You have this line in the book, which I thought was very tantalizing, where you said, females get sicker, but males die quicker. And there is some science to back this, that in some ways, although women are often more ill, they will survive for much longer, whereas men might end up dying because of the same diseases.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we do know for sure is that, and this is largely biological, but also partly cultural, is that men die younger. So usually life expectancies are longer for women all over the world. And this is partly biological. There is a kind of toughness, physiological toughness that women have. And it may be something to do with the body being equipped to deal with all the pressures of childbirth and the rest of it. So we do see this, that men die at younger ages. Although, again, those gaps are changing, and it really depends on the area, the region of the world that you're looking in. But it's a fascinating question, yeah.
Also, you have this line about immunity and how because women give birth, and in essence, the baby is a foreign tissue in the woman's body, her immune system works very differently from the male body, right?
I wouldn't say very differently, but yeah, there are subtle differences there. I hesitate to say very differently because I catch every single cold in my house, and my husband never gets sick. So, I'm not about to claim that all women have perfect immune systems, because we genuinely don't. But certainly on average, you see that women have a slight immunity edge over men. Again, for physiological reasons, possibly linked to childbirth. There are these differences there, but they're not hard and fast. And we have to be very careful about that, because during the pandemic, there was a claim made by some scientists that women were less likely to catch COVID-19 and that we should prioritize men, therefore, in guarding against the illness. That would have been a huge mistake, because these differences are very, very slight. They're average. So healthcare, public health, these are things that aren't relevant to public health. These are just interesting biological, quirks, facts.
I want to get to the final portion of the book, which talks about sexuality. And again, it's a fascinating segment in the book. You make the point, or you speak of studies which have looked at birds, etc., where you do see, even in the animal kingdom, there are species where the males guard their mates, that they don't want their females to mate with others, and they will harass them, prevent them from being near other males, etc. And you see, obviously, that in human beings as well. But the assumption somehow that the female sexuality is tame, that it's not actually as active as the male sexuality, or that men are much more sexually vigorous and women don't have that much desire, you sort of push back against that idea.
Well, why would males go to such trouble to control females if there was no risk of those females ever mating with anybody else because they were so sexually inhibited? That doesn't make any sense. The same argument has been made, to claim that women are sexually far less active or far less interested in sex than men. Well, if that were true, then why do we go to such lengths to stop women from having sex? Why do we have all these rules and regulations and, so many different diktats? I mean, one very obvious one is female genital mutilation, which is essentially just sewing up a woman. Why would you have to do that if there was no risk of her ever having sex anyway? Why would you have to do that to young girls if there was no risk of of them in their teenage years ever having sex with someone anyway? So I think it's a ridiculous claim to be making, that women are somehow just passive creatures and men are the sexual creatures, because all of human cultural history points to the fact that men have gone out of their way to control female sexuality.
You also, I think, cite a scholar who went and stayed with a group or a tribe in Africa where they actually have females with plenty of sexual agency. And these are married women who do have affairs on the side, and it's completely normal in their situation. And they were actually stunned that the researcher wasn't doing the same, that she was being loyal to her husband and she had this concept of fidelity as we define it. So it's also cultural, clearly, that there is.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt that marriage, monogamous marriage as we understand it, is not a universal custom. Different societies have different ways of doing things. And certainly there are matrilineal societies in which marriage really, in some way, doesn't really exist. So, for example, if you look at the Moswo in northwestern China, this is a matrilineal society in China, and they have something known as walking marriage, or what has been called walking marriage. Walking marriage in the sense that when she comes of age, a woman is given a chamber in her mother's house, and she can invite a man in, and he leaves the next day. And she can invite whichever man she wants anytime. So it's not really marriage in a sense, or at least it only lasts for a night. So these are constructed ideas. I say that in hesitation because I'm very happily married. I love my husband. But I think many of us do have to ask, would we choose marriage necessarily if it wasn't the social custom? Would we necessarily all choose to get married and be monogamous if that wasn't the thing that everybody was expected to do? And that's a very hard question to answer. And I think perhaps, especially with people getting married so much later, some people foregoing marriage altogether, it's an interesting one. I don't think it's a given that we are necessarily a rigidly monogamous species.
You also talk about how in communities where women are segregated during their menstruation, there are purity taboos, etc. But in a way, it's also a form for men to keep an eye on the women and to control when they're fertile and to keep track of their bodily sort of changes. Even on the question of women being conditioned, and when you're talking about female genital mutilation, you talk about the 6-year-old girl who was actively looking forward for it and asked her mother to get it done because somehow all her friends had gone through it and she felt left out. It's quite scary to think the extent to which we can internalize these notions.
We become conditioned into these ideas. And I think all of us have to ask ourselves that. So my most recent book, The Patriarchs, is about the origins of patriarchy. How do these ideas about gendered divides, male domination, where did they come from? And it is devastating to see the extent to which women and girls are sometimes comply with cultures that clearly are designed to oppress them. And female genital mutilation, that's one example. There was a community in Africa in which the elders were told by foreign aid agencies that you must end FGM because we won't give you any aid otherwise. You must end this practice in your community. And the elders said, yes, that's fine, we'll stop it. The girls turned around and said, if you stop cutting us, we will cut ourselves. And the reason they did that was because they believed so deeply that this was a cultural practice that was rooted in their community, and they didn't want foreign outsiders coming in and telling them, you have to change your culture. They believed so strongly that this was a part of who they were. And in fact, if we look at, if any of us look at ourselves, haven't we all done that in some way or another? Made some kind of compromise because of culture, whether it is taking your husband's name when you get married, or fasting for your husband, or showing some deference to your in-laws. These kind of practices are all rooted in this idea that a daughter-in-law is the property of her in-laws, that, this kind of slave-master relationship that emerges. And we all participate in it. We don't question it. And in fact, we allow it to happen because we are committed to the cultural aspects of it, because it means so much to us, because we care about it, and we don't want to lose that sense of who we are. So as much as we might want to live in a gender equal society in which gender doesn't matter and we can be free to be ourselves as individuals, it is often culture that holds us back. And we all do it. I've done it myself, that I also participate in these things because I want to, that culture matters to me. It means something to me too.
we're running out of time, so before I open up to audience questions, I also wanted to ask you about Donald Trump. It's difficult to avoid bringing Donald Trump into conversations today. He's now decreed in the US that there are only two genders. You do go into the whole gender idea in this book that, you know, whether it's a spectrum, there are men who perhaps identify as females, there are women who are supposedly more masculine, etc., etc. How do you look at this whole gender debate that's playing out largely in the West, but also it matters in countries like ours?
Yeah, I mean, this is the subject of my next book. I'm looking at classification. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, why does a state care about sex or gender? What difference does it make to Donald Trump who is male or female? And the reason is that historically, almost all the laws in the United States regulated what you could do based on your sex. So if you were a woman, you know, not very long ago, you couldn't vote. There were certain jobs you couldn't do. You had to give up a federal job if you got married. There were a whole host, I mean, so many laws.
You also have a case somewhere in the book of a woman who, I mean, her research won the Nobel Prize, but her supervisor got the prize and not her.
No, that happens a lot. Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who I know, yeah, she was junior to him. He got the Nobel Prize. But to be fair, I feel that she's got a lot of credit for that over the years. So a lot of accolades have come her way, you know, after the fact, because people recognize it was such a huge, it was just completely wrong in every sense of the word. But many, you know, it was only until very recently that there were many laws on the books in many countries in the world that really did define what you could and couldn't do based on your sex. So it mattered to the state to know your sex, because how else would you administer these laws? They wouldn't have any meaning otherwise. In fact, even in this country, still now, marital rape is legal. It's just shocking to me that the state doesn't outlaw that. So the reason that Donald Trump is interested in this question is not because he wants to say, it's not really just about intersex or transgender people. It's not about non-binary people. It's about everyone. He is saying, this is what a man is, and this is what a woman is. The reason that all this rhetoric about masculinity and how men and women should behave, and this is appropriate, if you look at some of the anti-abortion laws and some of the anti-trans laws, in certain states in the US, they specify that a woman should behave in keeping of what is expected of women, and a man should behave in keeping of what is expected of a man. So this is about controlling every single one of us. It's about saying you can't step out of the boundaries of what is expected of you, that women can't do what men do, and men can't do what women do, that we are going to draw a very firm line between those things. And that's why every one of us should be nervous about what Donald Trump is doing.
You know, this isn't a scientific question, it's more of a cultural question. Around the world, we're seeing the rise of nativism. Around the world, population demographics are changing, for example, in the UK. And there is an anxiety among white people, for example, that there are more brown people around, that towns are changing, there are more Muslims around, there are more black people around. So there is a demographic anxiety that's growing. And often you find, historically, at least in moments like this, people fall back on traditional ideas, right? So though we have this amazing wealth of knowledge now about gender, about sexual differences, all of that, and scientific knowledge, do you fear that perhaps we'll sort of lapse backwards because of these cultural trends where people are in a mode of cultural panic?
Well, it doesn't have to be this way. It's really because politicians have whipped people into this frenzy, made them believe that their latent prejudices aren't just prejudices, that they're rooted in fact, and that the real threat is elsewhere. You know, as soon as there is any kind of trouble in an economy, as soon as things are, you know, people are suffering, the easiest scapegoat is the new person, the foreigner, the immigrant, you know, the person on the margins, the most vulnerable. And this is an old trick. It's been done, you know, dozens of times before. We've seen it again and again. And really, all it does is divert people away from the real cause of the problem, that poverty isn't being addressed, that inequality isn't being addressed. The amount of inequality in the US, the wealthiest country in the world, is remarkable. That the majority of wealth in that country is in the hands of the top 10%. Almost all the wealth is in the hands of the top 10%. And there is a fentanyl crisis. And you can see this all over the world, that inequality is rising. And instead of saying the rich are to blame, governments, politicians, populists say, no, it's those other people. It's the immigrants that you should be worried about. It's the Muslims that you should be worried about. It's the rich people who are running this racket, you know. And you only have to look at the people they prioritize, the Silicon Valley billionaires, to know who is really running this show.
We'll open up to audience questions now, but I'll just read out what I thought was, a very good closing quote that you have in the book, where you say that when men understand that the best way to solve their own problem is to help women solve those that men have created for women, they will have taken one of the first significant steps towards its solution, which I thought was a very fine note for the book to end on. On that note, questions. And I'm assuming there's a volunteer with a mic. Mic isn't working. Mic is...
Hello, hello. Okay. Hi, ma'am. It was really interesting, especially about the heart attack part, because I also believe this thing that, oh, women's heart attack is different, and that's why we were underdiagnosed and all of it, because I had heard it from like what I thought were reliable sources for a long time. So, but I also want to talk. I also wanted to. I don't know, because I don't follow a lot of science research, especially about pregnancy. Because it's a condition, it's a huge thing that a person with a uterus is going through, but there is so less research about it because obviously we're worried about the baby. So it's such a complicated matter. How can we move forward? Because without this information about pregnancy, again, mother's mortality rates are also high. So without this information, and so how do we deal with this whole thing?
Well, you'll be pleased to hear that women's health research, especially reproductive research, a lot more investment has gone into this since the 1990s. So billions more dollars has gone into that kind of work. But you're right, it's dangerous work. And you will remember that in the 1960s, there was the thalidomide crisis. So women were given this drug, thalidomide, to cure morning sickness, and it caused enormous birth defects, deaths among children. And there has always been a nervousness since then to run clinical trials on pregnant women or women who could get pregnant for understandable reasons. We have to protect, that child. So it's difficult. It's not an easy thing to do. And in some ways, there is, other species give birth so easily. Human anatomy, for instance, is quite remarkable in how much help women need to give birth. There are very few cultures in the world in which women give birth alone. Many primates do. So female primates of other species often go and give birth alone. Humans can't do that. We need help. I needed a lot of help when I gave birth, I can tell you. It was horrible. And I wouldn't have survived. I lost a lot of blood. I hemorrhaged, and I wouldn't have survived if I didn't have all that help around me. So partly it's a function of our anatomy that we have so badly evolved for this really fundamental function. But there are innovations that should be possible in that space. It's just very difficult to do for the reasons you say, that you're talking about real people with real babies here, and then how do you do that safely? But it is happening. I mean, the amount of investment into women's health is remarkable now. It's huge.
Who's next? There's a question at the back. Oh, here. All right.
Hi. So actually, my question was kind of touched on by the previous one thing. But so I come from a medical background, and you were mentioning about heart attacks and how, like, when I was studying, yeah, they gave us a certain set of symptoms, and then later on, like you touched on in the last 20 years, they mentioned that, like, because of the lack of data, we actually didn't study enough women, so they present differently. And then you mentioned that there's been kind of a bioessentialism kind of happening, and that's been coming back, and you mentioned that your next book kind of touches on that. So I was wondering if you could share more on that.
Yeah, there is. I mean, I repeated this fact. Inferior came out in 2017, and I was being told by doctors at the time, women have different heart attack symptoms. And I took that as given. I believed it because it's in the medical literature. In 2019, someone finally investigated this. They actually looked at the data. It was a study carried out at the University of Edinburgh by the British Heart Foundation, and they found that men and women were equally likely to have typical heart attack symptoms. They were still the most common. So the big symptoms, you know, pain in the left arm, chest pain, were common symptoms among men and women. Although women are slightly more likely to present with unusual symptoms, that's still true, but by and large, the majority of heart attack patients will have those common symptoms. What this study found was that one of the big reasons that women were going underdiagnosed was, as I said, they weren't believed that they got to the hospital or they were at home and nobody thought they were having a heart attack. Whereas if they had been male, they would have thought, okay, that looks like a heart attack. You're a man, you're likely to have a heart attack. Even the women themselves, they didn't know, so they spend longer before they call the doctor because they don't believe they're having it. So, that's a cultural idea that we have to get over. And actually, there are a number of conditions you will know as a medical doctor that used to be less common in women, but are becoming more common as women become more sedentary, as diets change, as women start doing similar work to men. So we have to take account of that. We have to look at it. And in the same way, so for example, if you look at breast cancer, a lot of breast cancers in men get missed because people don't think that men can have breast cancer. So your likelihood of dying from breast cancer if you're a man, if you have breast cancer and you're a man in the United States, is higher than if you're a woman because you're likely to come to the doctor later with your symptoms. That's not to say, like I said, I'm not saying that biological differences don't exist. Of course, there are some biological differences, but we have to understand the cultural component because if we don't, then we just exacerbate those problems. Yeah.
I think there was a question at the back somewhere. There.
Hi, ma'am. So thank you for that. I unlearned a lot from your book, like from Geek Nation to Patriarch. I mean, I have read all those. So I am waiting for your coming book. And about Inferior, I have a question that about female genital mutilation that you mentioned now. You wrote about, so I think knife on any genital child abuse, like, so you also wrote a chapter about intersex, how doctors doing when a intersex child born. So you also wrote about that. So what do you think about the male genital mutilation? I mean, which is normalized in our society many times.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't write about that, but there have been arguments made that that is just as brutal and just as unfair to children. But it's not something I address, and I don't think it has the same rationale as female genital mutilations. The reasons for doing it aren't the same, they're different. But, why mutilate children at all? Why do anything to them? In fact, there's a very large intersex movement. It's routine, or it has been routine, for doctors to operate on intersex babies in order to bring them into alignment with one or the other sex. And there's a large intersex movement. I have friends who are intersex who are arguing, just leave us alone. Let us make our own decisions as we grow older. And there's a really good, there are good psychological justifications for that.
Yeah? Okay, that side. Where's the mic? Mic ever poi? Our cone, there's somebody. Next to. Yeah.
What do you think about the West and Asia? Because the feminist movement around the world is booming, but the Donald Trump and the patriotic ideas is right now dominating or coming back because of the feminist movement. Do you think the feminist movement have come to end, or it has a good future to fight against the patriarchy, because the cultural patriarchy?
So do you think the feminist movement has sort of come to its end point, or do you think it has a prolonged life to further fight against patriarchy?
No, I don't think the feminist movement is at its end point at all. I just think it's changing. So the things that people were fighting for in the early 20th century, obviously we're fighting for different things now. I think the legal battle has been largely won, but not everywhere. So, for example, in Afghanistan, that's the big frontier for us as feminists, is how do we secure rights for those women and girls who have so cruelly lost everything. So in certain countries, in certain parts of the world, I think there is still so much work to do. In countries like India, where we are getting closer to legal equality, then I think the next frontier is cultural change, psychological change. How do we change the way we behave and think about each other? How do we change relationships within the home, the division of labor within the home? How do we make it normal for men to do housework the way that my dad does? How do we change everyday relations between people? That's still a big thing, and a lot of work needs to be done there.
All right, last question.
Hi, ma'am. Actually, I couldn't read your book. I hope you discuss about the fate of Rosalind Franklin regarding this double helical model in which Watson recorded appreciation, but she was neglected. Similarly, there are several other occasions like Lissay Meitner. So many things are there in the past. Even in the present also, so many oppressions are there. How you forecast the future? Apparently, I don't know whether you know about, currently the topmost scientific body of India is chaired by a lady scientist, Dr. Kalai Selvi. So how you are thinking about the future? Whether it will be bright or will be dim like this?
Oh, that's a very good question to end on. I think about these things all the time. I veer between optimism and pessimism depending on what happens. And in fact, that's natural. There was a sociologist in the 20th century, Louis Kosa, and he argued that human society is always about conflict. There's a constant conflict. And in fact, that conflict is necessary because that's how change happens. That we are always fighting against each other. There will always be people who want more power and status than other people. And there will always be people that want a more equal society, and we're always pushing and pulling. So if we want that society, we can't just assume it's going to happen. It's not going to happen on its own. We have to always make the case for it. And also, I think it's very important to make that case for boys and men, as well as for girls and women. We've done a good job as feminists of encouraging girls to think, I can do anything. But boys also need to be taught that they can do anything. They can also work at home, be stay-at-home dads. They can also do all the work that women do. That they shouldn't feel, that there is such a thing as men's work or women's work. They should also feel free to be themselves and not be afraid of their so-called feminine qualities.
On that note, thank you very much. We're done. They've got a performance coming up. Thank you again, and thank you, Angela, for the wonderful conversation.